So good morning, everyone. So welcome everybody, and day 2 and the second week of the COP30 here. And it's great to have you, some of you here. I hope more people are just walking in and going through the security, and hopefully we'll have a few more colleagues joining us in this important conversation. So my name is Maya Rajesh, and I'm the Managing Director for the Americas region for the Alliance of Biodiversity and CIAT. It is a CGI AR center. And we are really looking into science for impact, very much building on a lot of research and innovation to really get to impact. So today I have the great pleasure to open this session, which brings, this COP, one of the predominant conversation was very much about how to bring more finance into different climate action in general. And today we are bringing two important sessions, which is basically how do you bring more finance to more even conflict and humanitarian sector? And often these conversations are being held separately. And today, as many of you know, there is a massive divide in terms of gap in terms of where financing gaps are for climate action. But when you look at the fragile setting and humanitarian settings, it's even significantly higher. At the same time, more than 40% of the people who are affected by climate variability live in very fragile settings. So there's absolutely critically important that we bring these two domains together and bring these conversations together. So we're bringing two very important consortium and partners and a few more others in UNHCR's Environment Fund, and Pilar is here, and also for the BRICS Consortium, who is doing an incredible work in Somalia and very difficult regions of the world in bringing resilience. So one of these, as these, they will take the stage and tell us more about the current work they are doing. But as we are having into that conversation, what I will want to tell you is that in the CGIAR, we are really increasingly looking to see how science and data can really help to bridge the financing gap and to bring more evidence to the table so that the perception of the risk and in terms of investment can be reduced for bringing more sustainability. So there's definitely risk in every investment and every setting you put money into it, and we're bringing more data and evidence on the climate vulnerability and what's the rate of return of investment, and also kind of bringing, when there are good stories, we need to document it in a very scientific way so that future investments can be even much more easier in the fragile setting. So definitely not an easy task to bring more finance to very difficult settings and humanitarian and conflict, and there is, settings to bring. But there is also evidence to show that if you really restore environment, it brings more carbon and also brings more food security. So there is good evidence in showing in different settings that science and actually proven settings that this can happen. But we need to really amplify the voice and bring lots of important noise around and communication around it, that how can we actually scale these even further and bring those. With that, I want to hand it over to Pilar and invite some of the panelists here to speak more about what we are actually doing in these two domains, bridging finance gap and bringing more resilience to, and actually being communities are an important part of it. They are not beneficiaries. They're actually co-creating solutions together with the different partners. So they are not just receiving at the end. They need to be incredibly part of every conversation because they're actually very resilient and they're going through one of the most difficult challenges that we could possibly imagine. And even in those settings, how can we build up the capacity to actually address some of these crises moving forward? So with that, over to you, Pilar.
Thank you so much, Maya. And it's always very difficult to come after you because you make always such incredible points. So I'm representing today just not only UNHCR, but also the Norwegian Refugee Council. Unfortunately, Perrine couldn't be here with us today because she felt sick. But I think it's very important to also showcase not silo conversations. So everything that Maya said today about financing, we also had a panel yesterday in terms of how to bridge that gap. And the reality is that fragile contexts cannot wait for us to have the ideal situations in place, the ideal KPIs. We need to invest right now. And to do that, we need to build new models that reach essentially the quote unquote unreachable. It's very important as well what Maya said in terms of the co-beneficiaries. It's important to treat communities not as an afterthought or someone that we're going to deliver essentially solutions to, but an active integration of essentially partners in the solutions that we're building. And so this is what we've been seeing as we were building the Refugee Environmental Protection Fund, UNHCR. And for context, we're investing in a sustainable solution both on reforestation side, intended as ecosystem restoration, but also on clean cooking. And for reference, for those of you who are in the energy space, we're looking at least a tier 3+ on the IWA scale. And with that, we're also working, and specifically why it's so important to be here in Brazil, we're working on indigenous land in São Marcos and Roraima, with indigenous communities. And it's been actually really wonderful to be part of this process as well, because we're not only supporting and going through the protocols on ILO 169, but really build upon that and really integrate communities into what we're doing. And so with that, I actually want to bring my two panelists here with me today. I have Yuri Rugay Marinho. He's the founder and CEO of Econ Solution Ambientais, and our partner as well in Roraima. So welcome, Yuri. And then Aditya Bahadur, hope I'm not mispronouncing your name, who's the director of Red Cross, Red Crescent Climate Center. So thank you so much for being with us. And again, Perrine is not here today with us, but we'll try to also represent the food systems aspect of this, because food security, I hope we're making the case that is extremely interlinked to essentially the process that we're going through. And so with that, I actually want to start with the project that we're running in Roraima. And so I want to bring in Yuri here. And so one of the threads that we've been hearing is how difficult it is to build resilience and at landscape level, especially when you're also trying to build trust and legitimacy. And so in Brazil, again, we've been facing very similar questions, right, on how to work with communities, especially with indigenous authorities, and especially when it comes to high integrity carbon projects. And so you completed a full technical, legal, and commercial financial feasibility study for us at UNHCR for the São Marco project. And what I want to ask you is, what surprised you the most about the findings?
Can you hear? Yeah, it's working. So thank you, Pilar. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you all for being here. Se a senhora quiser perguntar em português, eu respondo. I'm just saying that I can speak in Portuguese if she wants, or anybody else. So yeah, I represent here Econ, which is a Brazilian company, a consultancy company, and we are also project developers. And when we had access to the project, and we felt that that could be an amazing opportunity for us to work with indigenous people, because here in Brazil we have a lot of communities, we have a lot of lands. I can show you some images. Yeah, and this is an incredible complex situation here in the country, because we have the carbon projects. We have like approximately 200 carbon projects in the country, but most of them are developed in private lands, because you need paper, you need documents, you need to study the area, to provide reports, and then you have to approve a project in a certification body. Then you have to sell the carbon credits, make contracts. So it's very complex, too expensive. And these indigenous people and traditional people and other, communities in the country, they are conserving most of the lands, most of the country. There are federal conservation units, state conservation units, municipal conservation units, permanent preservation areas, especially protected areas. I mean, a lot of different instruments to protect the Amazon and the other biomes that we have in the country. 60% of the country is covered only by the Amazon forest, but we have more forests in the country. So this part in green is the Amazon area, there are more countries than Brazil. So we have Brazil, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia. In this green area, most of Brazil is covered by the Amazon. But there are more places in the country with the same problem. So how to communicate, how to explain a, a, a type of solution that is related to the market with people that don't participate of the market. They are not included in the carbon market. So they are conserving, or they are exploring, they are living as they do for centuries. And then we just go there and say, oh, I can show you an incredible opportunity. The carbon market, it doesn't make sense at all. And it happens all the time. There are thousands of people in Brazil that signed contracts with, foreign companies, Brazilian companies, and nothing happens. But some people made a lot of money. So that's why it's very hard to go to them. And at this time, it will be true. At this time, they will not, they will not be like foolish. So for us, it was a very good opportunity to go with serious people, recognized institutions, following a script, following methodologies, and explaining how we would do and why that would work. And I'm very glad it worked, because we went there with people that know how to do that without a rush, and explaining everything and showing them our intentions. So there are other thousands of opportunities in the country. I'm not sure if all of them will, have this opportunity, but I think having the right people with the right methodologies is what we need. But it's expensive, right? You put a lot of money from the UN system and a lot of specialists, so it takes time. It takes very expensive, but I think that may work with other opportunities that we should talk to them and discuss with them based on their models,
No, thank you, Yuri. And I want to bring you in as well on a point. Yesterday was Biodiversity and Forest Day and Indigenous Day as well. I feel it's a very topical discussion as well on reforestation in the Amazon, especially indigenous communities. And so based on the work that we did together, I was wondering if you could come in and maybe tell us what does it take to do reforestation right in these areas, and the type of principles that you need to follow that way, and if there are any trade-offs that we should be aware of.
Yeah. So first, we have to ask them if they want to restore, the area. Why this is deforested? What happened? And then we can explain to them how, by restoring, they would receive carbon credits. And in a lot of indigenous communities, carbon credits doesn't make sense. This is something that doesn't exist. So sometimes we explain them that this is an invisible fruit and they are selling fruits. And then they say, oh, so these are fruits and we cannot take it, we cannot see it, right? Right. But we're selling. We are selling. And somebody is eating the fruit, the air is eating the fruit. Okay. And they are paying for that. Yeah, they are. Why? Because we have lack of fruits in the other parts of the country, of the world. Okay. And then they would take 1 day, 2 days, 10 days, or even years to accept that somebody is paying for these invisible fruits. And they are paying for these invisible fruits because I am planting trees. And they are not asking which kind of tree I'm planting. And why? Because I need to know which fruit is that, right? So this is the kind of conversation that we have in Portuguese, and then in English with you, and then in different languages, and then we have to translate to the certification body again. But we did that in different projects. We are always using the invisible fruit or the windy fruit. And I think it's working. But then we can show them and we are telling this is our way to see these things. This is like Brazilian, but it is also European. This is also American way of, dealing. And there is a convention on climate signed here in Brazil, and they will be here in Belém in November to discuss these invisible fruits in this market, and they start to accept. But they want to be here, for example, and follow the negotiations. So yeah, I think this is the challenge, but it works. And then if we return, and there's always the same person, and if we are talking the same things, and they will vote once, and they will vote twice, they will vote 3 times, and they will ask you again the same questions and try to see if you are giving the same answers, and then they will trust you.
Yeah, and I have actually a couple follow-up questions, and then I'm going to bring in Aditya as well. But just to say that this process was so successful that next week, actually, the communities will formalize the voting on the project, having already voted. And I was told that that was quite unique as well. So again, kudos, and like that shows also the importance, like again, to include communities from the get-go and not as beneficiaries as well. So I think that was obvious in terms of building the relationships. And this is also what we're here to do. And I feel it's a very important message to lend, because I've been part of several discussions in different panels where communities are almost like not present, or again, refer to beneficiaries. And not really, they're part of like the co-design, especially in these areas where it's their land. So I think it's an important point as well. The other point that sometimes we're making is that these fragile contexts are too risky for innovative financing, for investors to come in, etc. Right? And so based on the findings of our project, what would you say to them?
Well, I think they can always give up of the project. This is very risky. We can also, having their documents and all the processes and meetings that we have, and then we combine all these documents and present to the certification institution, and they, maybe they will not approve, and we don't have the project, or maybe we can, be in a situation of lack of money or lack of people, and then the project may again doesn't work. So there's a lot of risks, but that will also happen in a private project. So it happens all the time, independently on the situation. But I think most mistakes are made in this moment that we are right now, which is the conversation, because they don't trust us, right? We don't belong to that place, and we cannot just go there and give a solution. This doesn't make sense. And it happens all the time. This is the most common thing that happened here in Brazil and other countries. So if we are able to hear them and respect their decisions and their way of making decisions, and then difference of the cultures, because we need a contract. They don't. We need money for specific things. They don't. We have a time frame. They don't. But they conserve. We don't. They will plant. We don't. So I think we have to understand, and we have to check if we are also able to do this. And the project may be suspended at some time, and then we can again restart. But the project may also, continuously have a success, and we may have money and people and time, and then the certification works, and then we will sell the credits. So yeah, I'm very positive in this situation because we have serious institutions working together. I think we made the right decisions from our side. Probably they did the same at their side. And then they can also, having conversation with their neighbors, other people. In this area, they have 650,000 hectares, which is like the size of cities combined. And they are 18,000 people. And they have just 350 hectares degraded. So it's a small area, degraded area, but the degradation may continue. And then we have, you know, a larger project with conservation and restoration with more people. And then we can have them to be here with us and explain why they choose this specific methodology, which is the gold standard, why they didn't choose the other methodology, why they are selling carbon credits, why they are trusting in us. And then that will be a case, that will be a project. And then we have 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And I think then we will have a really success case, right?
Yeah, and so last question, because what I'm hearing is essentially we have to have a common language. And what I'm hearing also is that governance is extremely important alongside with trust. And so in this project, but also in other projects that you're carrying out in the region, I was wondering if you could share with us what you learned about building what we can call legitimate and right-based type of model of governance, where we're bringing in people and we're bringing in communities to be able to actually achieve something together.
Yeah. Well, communities, there are communities that want to develop the projects. So they come to us and they ask us, I want you to develop our project, but it's not simple for us to, you know, sign a contract with them, receive money from them, because it's very expensive. They don't have this money many times. And the relationship is very delicate. When the UN and other institutions that are used to work in these areas, in these situations, you know, for decades, and they are recognized as institutions that have this kind of work, for us, it's so welcome, because we have a partner to, you know, share our fears, share our doubts, and, you know, give our comments and work together. And this specific part of the problem, which is the money, it's very delicate, because we need money to, you know, pay our laborers, our employees, to buy our machineries, to pay the infrastructure needs and things like that. The people in the community, they don't want to pay a lot of money to, you know, somebody work with numbers and reports and pay like 100,000 reais or 200. That's too expensive. The land for them costs less, you know, so doesn't make sense for them. So having funds working with technical companies, with the communities, is, I think, is the perfect combination. And we don't have that kind of situation a lot in the country. We have developers signing contracts with indigenous people or traditional communities in millionaire contracts, and then the developers are paying all the costs. And then we have a contract, and we have a purchase agreement for millions of dollars. And then they say, whoa, that's a lot. I didn't know about it. And there's a huge problem. So having the partnership, the governance, talking to them about these numbers and the cost and the complexity, I think is the perfect match for, you know, working in indigenous and traditional communities.
No, thank you, Yuri. And I think we have some beautiful pictures as well, our work together, maybe.
Me too here. So
This is
yeah, so these are, you know, the people that we had a few meetings with them. So this is part of, you know, the explanation of the invisible fruits. So this is Enrique and Marta from our team, and they explaining to them what are our intentions, and they are, you know, asking questions. So yeah, so this was very special.
Oh, thank you, Yuri. Yeah, I think there's a lot of learnings I feel from this project, and most of them are going back again to the fact that we need to trust one another. There has to be governance built, and there has to be respect as well. But the other thing that also these communities need, and this is where I want to bring in Aditya, is an enabling environment. And so we're bringing back essentially the context to global financing and how we actually can unlock that part as well, which is super relevant just to get on a more practical side as well. And so Aditya, you and your team work exactly at that intersection. So linking science, risk, and finance. And so I really wanted to bring you in on this point and need to build systems that anticipate also climate stress rather than also just react to it. This is a very important also conversation in terms of mitigation and adaptation. And so the first question I have for you is, from your perspective, what's missing in how current climate finance frameworks engage fragile contexts, and especially how can anticipatory or risk-informed approaches help close that gap?
Great. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this event today. My name is Aditya. I lead an organization called the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, which is the nodal think tank on climate change for the global Red Cross system. We have about 100 people across 35 countries and a number of programs of work. The secret sauce that's sprinkled all over our work is anticipatory action. And we have a very large and substantial program focused squarely on issues in conflict and climate. So you're absolutely right. We do work at that intersection. I think the international finance architecture is absolutely not geared at the moment to deal with conflict-affected contexts. Through this COP over the last few days, I've heard innumerable mentions of fragile contexts, but I feel like scalable models, things that have worked, experiments that demonstrate potential for impact are still quite scarce. It's quite a value-laden discourse without much meat at the moment behind it. And I think there are a few key issues when it comes to international financing arrangements vis-a-vis conflict-affected countries. The first is the incredibly risk-averse nature of people who are providing finance. And I think it's a pretty obvious point, but all the financing protocols are prepared for a context which is stable, which has strong institutions, which has working civil society, which has a functioning public sector, overlooking the specific challenges that conflict-affected countries face. So I think firstly, I think funders have to get real if they want to deliver impact on the ground. That's the first important thing. Partly why this is happening is because of insufficient conflict sensitivity. People who are preparing the calls for proposals and putting out the big tenders don't really understand the context of conflict-affected countries. And therefore, we need a systematic capacity building approach across financing institutions so that project and program managers really understand what are the specific needs of conflict and affected countries and fragile countries. The additional challenge is that in countries, it can vary, right? The same country can have large parts of its jurisdiction that are conflict affected and large parts that are pretty stable. So it will require variegated, fairly nuanced approaches. But without this conflict sensitivity, we're not going to make any real headway. The third obvious point is around weak institutional capacity within recipient countries. I think one of the hallmarks of fragile countries is the fact that they don't have the ministries of finance and the climate finance units and all the other institutions that regular countries have. There are some outlier examples which we need to build on. I was part of a 5-year project to develop Afghanistan's first climate finance unit. And I'd love to share more in the question and answers there. So it is possible to develop these institutions, but by and large, there's weak institutional capacity and funders need to recognize that. And the implications of that are that your go-to institutions need not be big national level ministries or departments. They could be a whole host of other organizations that are stepping into the void to provide the kind of services that these institutions might in other places. It could be, in certain cases, the private sector. It could be civil society organizations, or controversially, it could be non-state actors like armed groups. I was shocked to learn earlier this year that 200 million climate vulnerable people live in areas that are controlled by non-state armed groups. And so they're a very important constituent. So we can either choose to consider them to be illegitimate or reconcile with the reality and try and make overtures to them to see if anything is possible. And there are little flashes across the world that demonstrate that we can work with non-state actors on issues of climate adaptation and risk reduction effectively. A couple of other things to underline is that there's the issue of local ownership, which is particularly difficult in fragile countries if you take traditional approaches. These are not contexts that are going to lend themselves to complex multi-level governance frameworks or even approaches that rely on sort of village level democratic institutions of the type that you might have in India that provide a very stable rubric for robust participatory engagement. Here you'll have to take many more innovative approaches to generate local ownership. So the slightly depressing but quite blatant fact that I want to underline is this obsession with bespoke international public climate finance. No amount of international public climate finance can or will ever be necessary and ever be sufficient to meet the massive adaptation and risk challenges that exist in fragile countries. The only way forward is for risk-informed approaches. And this is a two-way street. We have to make sure that all development and climate investments are conflict sensitive. And equally, we have to make sure that all humanitarian investments are climate sensitive. And without this, we're going to achieve very little. I feel like all this talk of whether the fund for loss and damage is going to have a special window for conflict affected countries, etc. Okay, yes, that's all that's important. But I also worry it's partly a distraction, because if you look at the quantum of finance in all the global international climate funds put together, you can add the loss and damage fund to it. It's not even a fraction of what's needed to fill adaptation gaps around the world. And I would argue probably a fraction of what's needed to fill adaptation gaps in fragile countries. So unless we are mainstreaming, we're not going to get anywhere.
No, thank you, Aditya. And I think there's a lot actually in what you said that is making me reflect also just in terms of how we work as well and the gap. And yesterday we were in a panel again also with Maya, and we're talking about how research most of the times is focusing on the biggest financing gap overarching, but so little actually is focused on how that financing gaps then translate into implementation as well. And so where I want to bring you in is that I read that the climate center that you're running often talks about anticipatory action, which I love, by the way, as a term. So I'll probably seal it in my work moving forward. And so to, again, like be very focused on implementation, what would it take for financing mechanisms, whether public or also blended, as everything we talk about so far, to support, again, this preemptive resilience in the places that we're describing? And obviously, again, here, primarily, we're talking about Roraima and Brazil. Somalia, unfortunately, is not represented in this panel, but just in general, I think there's a lot of similar learnings, essentially, from the same context. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak about that for a second.
Yeah, thanks for that. Just as an aside, I became the director of the Climate Center about 18 months ago. But one of the things that I'm most proud of this institution is that it's been part of a tiny clique of institutions that has, for the last 20 years, been consistently emphasizing the importance of anticipatory action. 20 years ago, when I was starting off in my career, I remember the fact that forecast-based financing was a revolutionary idea. The fact that you can unlock financing based on forecasts of what's about to happen, as opposed to responding to disasters after they've occurred, was an absolutely novel concept. And now, 20, 25 years later, it's become so mainstream in the humanitarian system, so as to almost be boring and passé. So I think we've very successfully tipped the humanitarian system into being much more ex ante as opposed to ex post. So to answer your question, I'm going to blatantly plagiarize a few points from a paper that's been written by some of my colleagues on the Baku to Belém roadmap, where they identify a few key things that need to change. One of the things that need to change is financiers and funding organizations need to accept reasonable risks when allocating climate finance. They need to determine what they exist to do, right? if they exist to reduce vulnerability where it matters most, then they have to accept reasonable risks. If they just want to tinker on the margins and provide funding to contexts that might be have a baseline level of resilience, then sure, go ahead, but then you're not having the impact that you're meant to have with taxpayers' money most of the time. They need to adopt climate and conflict policies that integrate a comprehensive risk management approach, which includes the risk of conflict. And I can go into much more detail, but this includes tangible mechanisms like crisis modifier funds. I was the head of research for a big program called BRACED, which was the largest investment in community-based resilience development, taking place in 9 countries. 11 countries. 6 of those 11 countries were conflict affected and fragile. So in those countries, what the UK FCDO did was they ring-fenced a crisis modifier fund to say that as your projects unfold in these fragile and conflict affected countries, we will make this emergency pot of money available to you. Should conflict break out, you can access this pot to adapt to the fragile context in which you're operating and try and ensure that you still continue to deliver the outcomes that you do. So building in tangible mechanisms, accepting that you're operating in a highly dynamic context with multiple interacting risks, including the risk of conflict, is particularly important. The second critical action that needs to take place is working across scales. Far too often, bilateral and multilateral donors focus at the national level. Their mandates force them to primarily deal with national ministries of finance, right? But in fragile conflict-affected countries, that's not always the most effective entry point. In many countries, there might be multiple national ministries of finance, right? Because they are competing parallel governments all arguing for legitimacy. And therefore, you have to take a much more evolved, creative approach where you're including small-scale local adaptation actors, which could include the private sector, could include armed groups, as we've talked about, could include nascent civil society organizations. And in many cases, you need to take a top-down and bottom-up approach simultaneously. I'll give you an example from my own experience, again, of operating in Afghanistan, where we were trying to institute a climate budgeting initiative within the Ministry of Finance, and we were getting nowhere. The Ministry of Finance was like, who are you people coming and talking to us about this very sophisticated climate budgeting mechanisms when we're trying to control conflict, when we're trying to deal with displacement, when we've got a massive drought unfolding in large parts of the country, when we're trying to get emergency food aid to mountainous regions. And so, of course, we tried to make all the arguments to demonstrate that climate budgeting wasn't some esoteric exercise, but was about dealing with all these emergencies. But what we did was we tried to find entry points at the ministerial level in the Ministry of Climate Finance. But we also realized that Kabul actually had a pretty active civil society scene. There were a whole range of tiny environmental groups that we then brought together, networked, and mobilized. And suddenly, newspapers in Kabul started carrying stories about the need for climate adaptation. And the ministry started to realize, oh God, there's actually a constituency here that cares about this stuff. It's not only these international consultants in their suits who are coming to us to talk to us about climate financing. So this top-down entry points and bottom-up mobilization of civil society could be an effective entry point, even in some pretty difficult contexts, like it did work in Afghanistan. And then a couple of additional points. Sorry for the very long-winded answer. I feel like, to me, again, now I'm in my 20th year in this profession, and I feel like all the time I keep coming back to the basics. There was a time I clearly remember when mainstreaming climate risk in programs and policies was the thing that everyone talked about. Somewhere along the line, that became unsexy. And I cannot understand why that happened. To me, that still remains the answer to many of our problems. We're never, again, I'm saying the depressing reality again and again, never, even the most optimistic projections of international public climate finance going 50 years into the future underline that we're never going to have enough international public climate finance to fill the adaptation gaps. It's only existing national domestic sources of funding that will need to be shaped to meet this gap. With your permission, one tiny illustration. which is not particular to conflict-affected countries, but demonstrates my point. 11 years ago, India launched its most ambitious national urban development program called the Smart Cities Mission. It had an allocation of $20 billion, largely of domestic resources. At that point, it was completely blind to climate risk. And so if at that point, an international donor had invested $500,000 in technical assistance to work with the Ministry of Urban Development to mainstream climate risk in the Smart Cities mission, we would have shaped $20 billion so that this $20 billion is also contributed to enhancing resilience across cities in India. So mainstreaming is key, and I think there's a lot of potential for that in conflict and fragile affected countries.
Yeah, and I feel you actually answer a lot of also the last question that I had for you. And in the meantime as well, I had also a couple questions still for the panelists and for Maya. But if you have any questions as well, I think we're very happy to take them. So the last question is essentially what I'm hearing is a change is needed. What a surprise. I feel every panel that I've been part of, there's something like systematic that needs to change. And so also in this case, and again, you already answered, I think, most of it, but in just 1 to 2 sentences, what needs to change for meaningful financing essentially flows to come into this context?
Try and take not more than 90 seconds. Apologies for the last very long answer. One is, I think there's scope for blended finance, which we need to look at a little more carefully in fragile and conflict-affected countries. Combining grants with small-scale equity investments, combining bilateral aid with domestic resources. We can tinker around with a lot of different financing mechanisms. The second is, I think you mentioned this in one of your questions as well, far too much emphasis is placed on funding projects to deliver outcomes. Far too little investment goes in building an apparatus to deliver projects that deliver outcomes. So creating investments in an enabling environment is absolutely key. Yesterday, I was on listening to a panel with the head of private sector investments at the GCF, and I asked them the same question, that what happens in fragile and conflict-affected countries? And they said the GCF is planning on investing in propping up the private sector in fragile and conflict-affected countries, recognizing that public institutions may not be able to play this role, but private sector institutions might. And then the third thing I will argue is, again, there has to be, I don't know how to put it, but there has to be a structured process of reflection within donors providing financing about why they exist. If they exist to help the most vulnerable, then they have to expand their risk appetites to operate in fragile and conflict-affected countries.
No, thank you. Super. Just want to check in case there are any questions from the audience. In Português también.
Hi, yeah, thank you for the talk. Super interesting. My name is Daniel Gorvin. I'm with the START network. So 145 organizations, part of the clique that is focused on anticipatory action. I was really interested what you were saying about working with armed groups. And you said there were some successful examples of that. I just wondered if it would be possible to kind of elaborate on that a little bit, particularly, yeah, kind of overcoming anti-terrorism, counter-terrorism legislation. And yeah, it would be great to just hear a little bit more on that. Thanks.
Sure, thanks, Daniel. Of course, the START network has been a fellow traveler in this very long and arduous journey over the last 20 years. I'm going to take the lazy way out. We have a paper that we've co-written with the Overseas Development Institute on engaging with non-state armed groups. So I'll share that with you. But essentially, across the examples, what is common is it's not sort of big multi-year partnerships and multi-million-dollar funding arrangements with armed groups. It's tiny, tactical, opportunistic partnerships to deliver very specific kinds of interventions at the local level, which allows us to circumvent some of these onerous anti-terrorism legislations. It is a minefield, but progress is possible.
Anybody else? Any questions? Okay, then I have one more, and Maya as well, in case you want to answer it. So a lot of this work, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because I feel also scale became a buzzword in the space and not necessarily everything needs to scale. But for financing, unfortunately, most of the time it translates in scale. And so if you just think about a market lever or a policy lever that needs to change for this work to go at scale, what would it be and maybe why as well? Want to take it?
Maya, you want? Okay. So I'll give a few words on the Brazilian perspective and more focus on the carbon market, right? So I think we need the regulation. So we have federal laws here in Brazil. So we need regulations to give the rules for the public money to be invested and the private money to be invested in conservation, restoration. We have in the country, goals of stopping deforestation, recovering 12 million hectares of degraded areas, stopping deforestation until 2030, and making our agribusiness better and with less emissions of GHG. So I think we need public decisions, we need the regulation, but we also need the voluntary market to evolve. And this project is much more related to the voluntary market, for example. And we need also financing systems to be, better designed. For example, the TFFF, the facility that we're discussing here. So they are not donating money directly to the projects. They are investing the money, and then part of the results is applied in these projects. So this is, modernizing the solutions. And that's what we need to do to scale these, to understand what did not happen, what didn't well, what worked, what are the good examples, and exploring them. And I think we are doing that right now, right? Here in Belém, we have all the private discussions across the countries. We are discussing yesterday about it. So these houses that they created across the city, they are discussing implementations. They are discussing results. They are discussing experiences. And we have also here the green zone, the blue zone. So I think it's happening, and we need to keep scaling and using the good examples and combining the NGO experiences with the private companies, with the agro business companies, with the mining companies, oil and gas companies, and the governments. And so I think we are doing, and should be just should keep doing that, right?
Okay.
Before Maya comes in, I got a delicious TFFF certified chocolate as I entered COP this morning.
I come from a bit of a science perspective here. I mean, those who write the proposals and project dealing with World Bank or any multilateral banks and GCF, you have to build a climate rationale. You have to provide quite a bit of evidence to really provide what's the rate of investment, what works in which settings and why, and definitely always in any proposal and a good proposal. And, when you build a partnership together, those kinds of data are incredibly important. So, and this is where I think, when you talk about food systems and agriculture sector and nature conservation, restoration, this data from across different contexts are still very dispersed in nature. And there's still an opportunity for us to really build that data ecosystem together in a much more collective way, rather than, when you have to build this project in Afghanistan. So let's look at the data, who has the data and what kind of metrics we need. So this is a kind of, we are constantly iterating and not learning enough to really build on those kind of great examples. And then, I think this is where also the scientific organizations like CGIAR and the Alliance of Biodiversity, we could come in and really be more helpful in supporting these proposal and project developments and providing the support. And kind of, again, the perception of the risk is need to be coming down for the finance to flow in. And that's even required, even governments taking loans from international financing agencies. they also need to show that their investment will lead to sort of return in future and the development will need to happen. And for that to happen, you got to pick up some pilots that have actually been successful with some evidence and data behind it, so that when it's scaled up can effectively lead to development in the country. And obviously the country need to return the money back to this institution. So this cycle can, and it's like great investment can lead to great development, but there is still more an opportunity to build some of these data ecosystems and evidence to be brought together in a more collective manner, in a consistent manner. And perhaps it could be at a different regional levels, or it could be a global level. Global level perhaps looks very daunting to think about it, like, but there is an opportunity for us to really take that piece a little bit more consciously to build those science and data together, which is kind of readily available for when opportunities arises.
So I think you asked about big macro shifts that might achieve transformation in this domain. If I'm going to be
question.
I'm going to be bold and say, if I look back over the last 5 years, the most significant macro shift that's happened came in July this year from the ICJ, when they issued a judgment to underline how states are liable to protect their citizens from harm from climate change. So I'm going to be left field and say, I sometimes feel that we are operating too much in our own bubbles and feel like, oh, okay, a report here or a policy there can make a difference. But I feel like the ICJ opinion, I can guarantee when we're at COP 35 in 2030, and we look back over this decade, it's going to be the most important significant development that's going to take place, because a whole range of civil society actors and states and provincial governments are going to use that as an entry point for forcing greater funding, domestic funding of climate action across the world. And so I can't help feel that should we not try and see if another similar opinion from the ICJ on support to fragile states and climate action in fragile states is the way to go?
And I think that's there was a lot of clapping as well as some of the audience is leaving. I feel actually that's a powerful closure. So maybe I want to take this moment as well to thank everybody in the audience for joining. I know there's a lot happening, so thank you for choosing to be here. That's a very powerful closure. I feel also we've been talking probably also in this panel about lots of the essential solutions being siloed. So I think it's a very also important point to mention that food systems unfortunately wasn't represented in this panel today, but that was the intention. So it's also very important to note that if we're talking about climate solutions, they cannot be effective if we're not talking about food security as well and resilience of communities. So for instance, what we're doing as well with the project that I'm running at UNHCR is actually investing in green jobs, in livelihoods opportunities that are also very linked to agri-food overall. And so I think is that a very important, maybe if you want also provocative closure. And I do think we need to do better as communities to speak to one another and to speak with the finance community. And so with that, maybe I'm closing this panel. Please stay here because this pavilion has an amazing program. We have other panelists as well joining shortly. So thank you so much again. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week here at COP.